Southern Fried Rat is a scary story about strange dinner. Jim and Karen had gone to the movies on Friday night. After the film was over, they both felt pretty hungry, so they decided to stop somewhere for a bite to eat. But where? They discussed the decision for a while. Hamburgers? No, they always went for hamburgers after a movie. How about pizza? Well, that would be nice, except the only decent pizza joint around was in a pretty rough neighborhood. Neither Jim nor Karen relished going into that neighborhood, particularly at night. You never could tell what might happen. How about fried chicken? A brand new outlet for a popular fried chicken chain had opened up just a few blocks away. Why not, they decided, it would make a nice change from hamburgers. They drove over to the new fried chicken place. It was jammed. It seemed as if everybody in town had the same idea. Let's go someplace else, said Jim. It's so crowded that we'll never get a table. Karen wanted to stay. It smells so good, I really want chicken now. We can get a takeout order and eat it in the car. Jim didn't much like the idea of eating in the car. That got the upholstery dirty. But Karen's desire for fried chicken was too powerful to resist. Reluctantly, he agreed that they would get a takeout order and eat in the car. When they got to the counter, Jim ordered regular chicken and Karen ordered extra crispy. Jim shuddered as he imagined the extra crispy coating raining down on his clean upholstery. Behind the counter, uniformed attendants were working with amazing speed, packaging up the orders and passing them out to the throng of eager customers. Jim and Karen's order arrived in a matter of minutes, and they carried the box out to the car. The place had been so crowded that Jim had been forced to park in the back of the lot, beyond the reach of the parking lot lights. It was pretty dark inside the car, but you didn't need lights to eat fried chicken. Jim, worrying about the upholstery, ate in silence. Karen, who really was hungry, tore into her order and was loudly crunching away at the extra crispy. Hey, be careful about those crumbs, complained Jim. I am being careful, said Karen, talking with her mouth full. After a few moments the crunching stopped, and Karen said, You know, there's something funny about this fried chicken. It doesn't taste right. But she kept on eating for a moment. And then she said, It doesn't feel right either. Jim, you better switch on the light. He did. Karen was correct. There was something funny about the fried chicken. Sticking out of the extra crispy coating of the piece Karen had been eating was a 3-inch tail. Somehow a rat had gotten in with the chicken pieces. It had been floured, fried up, and served to Karen. She had eaten half of it before she found out what it was. As soon as she realized what she had been eating, Karen went into shock. Jim felt pretty sick too, but he managed to drive to the hospital, where Karen had her stomach pumped. Karen's family threatened to sue. The fried chicken chain paid them a huge amount of money to keep quiet about what had happened, so the case never got to court, and it was never written up in the papers. Of course, the chicken people deny that it ever happened. Karen's financial future is assured, but they say that now she won't eat anything that she doesn't cook herself. The Very Old Man is a scary story about a special patient in one hospital. Please write comment what happened with Louise. Louise Curtis had just graduated from nursing school, and she felt that she had been very lucky to land a job in one of the big, fancy private hospitals. She was terribly, terribly anxious to do well in her new job. To tell the truth, Louise wasn't the brightest person in the world. She had gotten through school by working twice as hard as anybody else. She intended to get through her job the same way. Louise was at the hospital early every day. She never left until the job she was doing was completed, even if it meant working an hour or two overtime. She never complained about extra work. But most of all, Louise Curtis followed orders. If the head nurse told her to change the sheets, she would change the sheets. If the head nurse told her that all the patients in the ward had to have orange juice at 11 a.m., they would have orange juice at 11 a.m. even if they didn't want it and didn't need it. You could count on that. Louise was a good soldier. Once she was given an order, she carried it out, without questioning and without grumbling, even if the order didn't make any sense. This quality didn't make Louise very popular with the other nurses. "She's just like a robot," they would say. "Wind her up and she walks, and if she hits a wall she keeps right on walking till she runs down." "She certainly doesn't have any initiative," said one of the kinder nurses. "But you have to admit she's a hard worker." "So's a mule," said an angry nurse. "She'll never get anywhere because she hasn't got any brains." But the administration will always use her example to try to make the rest of us look bad. You're always hearing things like, "Nurse Curtis doesn't mind cleaning all the bedpans," or "Nurse Curtis doesn't mind working an extra shift." I'm sick of hearing about what Nurse Curtis will do. Although the other nurses wouldn't speak quite that frankly, most of them agreed. The head nurse, of course, realized Louise's shortcomings and her good points. One day she went up to Louise and said, "Nurse Curtis, I've had my eye on you for quite a while now. You're not like most of the women today. You're a hard worker and you know how to follow directions. So I have a special job for you." She led Louise through a long corridor into a part of the hospital she had never been in before. At the end of the corridor was a locked room. The head nurse took a key that she wore on a chain around her neck and unlocked the door. Before she opened the door she said, "Nurse Curtis, what you see and hear from now on is for you, and you alone. It is never to be spoken of to anyone except me. Do you understand?" Louise said she did. "Good girl," said the head nurse. "I knew you could be trusted." She then opened the door and led Louise inside. The room contained an astonishing array of medical machinery, some of which Louise recognized, but much of which was totally unfamiliar to her. At the center of the room there was a bed, and on the bed was a very old man. The thin, corpse-like figure did not move. Wires and tubes led to various parts of the body. The only signs of life from the old man's form were very faint breath and the responses of the various monitoring machines to which he was attached. Some wires and tubes led from machines that kept him alive. Others led to machines that kept track of the faint flickering of life that remained within the shrunken body. The old man's face looked vaguely familiar to Louise. "Do you recognize him?" asked the head nurse. Louise shook her head. "Of course he's changed a good deal, but that is." The nurse spoke a name that anyone would recognize. Louise gasped. "I thought he was dead. He died years ago. The world thinks he's dead. But as you can see, he isn't. There's no telling how long he can go on this way. Now, your special duties are to come into this room 3 times a day to take the readings from these machines and record them on this chart. You are to change the fluids in these containers, and to..." The head nurse went through a long list of instructions. Finally she said, "This is most important. Under no circumstances are you to touch the patient. Don't touch him." Louise understood what she was supposed to do. Being diligent, she came into the locked room 3 times a day and did everything she was supposed to do. She followed her instructions to the letter. She never talked to anyone but the head nurse about what she did. And she never touched the body of the old man. The head nurse was very pleased with Louise's work. Louise did not have much imagination or curiosity, but after a few months even she became a bit curious. Day after day the patient just lay there without moving, barely breathing. The readings on the machine were always the same. Nothing ever seemed to change. Why, she began to wonder, can't I touch him? In his condition, he would never even feel it. The thought grew in Louise's mind until it became very nearly an obsession. Many days she would go into the room and reach out, nearly but not quite touching the old man. It was beginning to drive her mad. Then one day she could stand it no longer. She reached out and touched the old man lightly on the arm. Instantly his eyes opened. It was the first time that Louise had seen any movement other than shallow breathing in the corpse-like figure. Then his head turned from side to side, until he fixed his staring eyes on Louise. She stepped back from the bed in terror. The frail form sat up, pulling out a mass of tubes and wires, spilling fluids all over the bed, and starting the machines beeping and whirring frantically. A second later, the old man was on his feet and advancing slowly toward Louise. His eyes were glazed and his mouth hung half open. That sight propelled Louise into action. She dashed for the door, but found that it had locked automatically when she shut it. The old man was coming closer and closer. She ran to a corner of the room. With surprising speed, the old man followed her. She ran to another corner. Again he followed, this time getting closer. She ran again, and again the old man followed. Louise was beginning to get tired, but the horrible old man seemed to gain strength each time she ran. Finally, she felt she was trapped and could run no more. The old man reached out a skeleton-like hand and touched Louise's shoulder, causing her to shudder. "Tag," shouted the old man. "Now you're it." The second Blue Book is a story about enterprising and cunning students. Many colleges used special blue-covered exam booklets. They are called, appropriately enough, blue books, and are filled with lined paper. These books are handed out at the beginning of an exam, and the students must write their answers to essay questions in these special books. The books are supposed to ensure that the students don't come in with pre-prepared answers. Steve was a student at Upstate University. He was very bright and could have had straight A's, except for one small problem that he had. Steve hated to work. He loved to party, and he figured he was smart enough to bluff his way through exams. Sometimes he was right, sometimes he wasn't. He was right often enough to be able to stay in school, but wrong often enough that he was just barely hanging in there. As final exams approached, Steve found that this semester he was losing more often than he was winning. He faced the very real possibility that his semester average would be so low that he would actually flunk out of school. Which would mean that he would have to go home and might actually have to get a job. The thought sickened him. Steve had only one final left, American Lit. He didn't know a great deal about American literature, but almost by accident he had read a couple of the books that had been assigned. So he was confident that he would be able to bluff his way through the final, and that this grade would be high enough to give him a passing average. Steve was calm and assured as he entered the classroom to take the exam. He remained calm and assured as the professor handed each student 2 blue books. His calm began to shatter as the professor wrote 2 questions on the board. They were the only 2 questions on the exam. The second question was about something that Steve had read, and instantly a brilliant series of connections were made in his mind. His answer to question 2 would give him an A on that part of the exam. Question 1 was another matter. It was about something that he had never read, never even heard of. He drew 2 complete blank. There was nothing he could say about question 1. The result would be an exam score of 50, not good enough for a passing grade in the course and certainly not good enough to carry the rest of his marginal marks. The horrible specter of a job rose before him. But he took a few breaths and did not panic. Steve had a plan. He started filling the first book with anything that came into his head. Advertising slogans, nursery rhymes, anything. All he had to do was look as if he were working hard. When he had filled the first book with all that nonsense, he took the second book and wrote a big number 2 on the cover. Then he wrote what appeared to be the last sentence of an answer to the first question. Right under that, he began his answer for question number 2. It was a beautifully worked out answer, a sure A. When the exam was over, Steve got in a crowd of other students turning in their exam books. But he turned in only the second book. The first one was carefully hidden under his shirt. A few anxious days later, Steve got a postcard from his American Lit professor. Steve was told that he got an A in the course. The professor also apologized for having lost the first part of his exam. Steve's partner in indolence, his friend Jack, had an even worse problem. He didn't know the answer to either of the questions. But he was even cooler and more resourceful than Steve. Jack took one of the blue books and used it to write a letter to his mother in Boston. He said that he was writing to her because he had already finished his final exam and was waiting for a friend to finish. He apologized for not writing sooner, but said that he had been studying very hard for this particular test and had had no time. He also said that he thought he did pretty well on the test, but that the professor, though a good guy, had very high standards. When time was up, Jack handed in only the blue book with the letter to his mother in it. He had the blank blue book hidden in his notebook. He rushed back to his room, looked up the answers to the questions, and wrote them in the blue book. Then he put the blue book in an envelope and mailed it to his mother. A few hours later, Jack got a call from the professor, who was very puzzled. He wanted to know why Jack had given him a letter to his mother in Boston and not the answers to the final exam. Jack gasped. He said that there must have been a horrible mix-up and that he had by mistake handed in the letter to his mother and mailed his exam to Boston. He offered to call his mother in Boston, explain the situation, and have her mail back the letter, unopened, to prove that no one had tampered with it. The professor agreed to this plan, so Jack called his mother. She mailed back the unopened envelope with the blue book containing the answers Jack had looked up after the exam. Jack gave it to his professor. Jack got a B on his final. Lance, who went to high school in Los Angeles, came up with an ingenious solution when he was given a difficult 2-page quiz. He knew that there was no way in the world he would be able to finish the entire test. So he spent all his time working on the second page. At the end of the period, he handed in only the second page, concealing the first page in his notebook. He used the next period to quickly look up the answers to the questions on the first page and write them in. Then he took the test paper, threw it on the ground, and trampled all over it. He gave the paper to a friend who had a later class in the same room. When the friend handed the dirty, stepped-on paper to the teacher, he said that he had found it on the floor in the back and thought it might be important. The teacher checked through all of the test papers, and sure enough, Lance's paper was missing the first page. When the 2 pages were marked together, Lance got an A on the test. The Secondhand evening gown is a scary and sad story about one girl. Sally had never been the most popular girl in school. It wasn't her looks. She was really quite pretty. It wasn't her personality. She was bright, cheerful, friendly, and interesting. Sally's problem was money. She didn't have any, and most of the other girls in the school did. While other girls wore Calvins, Sally had to get along with jeans from Sears. Her sweaters had been worn and washed so many times that they lost whatever shape they may have had in the first place. They certainly didn't do anything for Sally's shape. And her coat, as someone rather cruelly pointed out to her, looked like it belonged in the Ancient History Museum. During the summer, when most of the other girls and most of the boys in the school were off at the seashore or some other vacation spot, Sally could be found behind the counter at the local junk food joint. The hours were long, the work was hard, and the pay was terrible, but she needed whatever she could get. Sally's father had walked out on the family when she was 6, leaving her mother as the sole support for 3 small children. Her mother had worked at a series of low-paying jobs in order to hold the family together, which she did, but just barely. In short, Sally was poor. Sally wasn't in the top clique in school, or the next to the top clique, or any clique at all. She just didn't have the time. When she wasn't taking care of her younger brother and sister or cooking and cleaning at home, she was out working somewhere or doing her schoolwork. Since she was naturally quiet, the most popular kids in school barely knew she existed. Therefore, it was a major shock to Sally and to every other girl in the school when Davy Phillips asked her to go to the prom. Davy was not only the best-looking boy in the senior class, he was also the best basketball player, he had the flashiest car, and he had the reputation of being a pretty nice guy, too. Sally knew who he was. They had been in some classes together, and they had talked from time to time. But she had no idea that he liked her, or that he had ever even really noticed her. He had, however, and when he went over a list of possible dates for the prom, they all seemed vapid or dumpy when compared to Sally. He knew Ollie about the hard life she had led, and he admired her. Although there was a good deal of nasty whispering when word of whom he had asked got out, Davy was the top dog of the top clique, and no one would dare tell him what to do. Sally was overjoyed at the invitation. She was also frightened and almost desperate because she didn't have anything to wear. At the prom, all of the other girls would have gorgeous new evening dresses. Sally not only didn't have a new dress, she didn't have any dress at all. Now in stories, a fairy godmother appears and turns the poor girl's rags into a beautiful dress. Or the girl's clever mother turns the kitchen curtains into something that would not look out of place on the pages of Vogue. This is not a story. There are no fairy godmothers, and Sally's mother couldn't even do a hem. Neither could Sally. "Maybe we could get a second-hand dress cheap down at the pawn shop," said Sally's mother. Sally wasn't too proud to wear a second-hand gown. Besides, there was no other alternative. So she and her mother went down to the pawn shop, and there it was, a beautiful satin evening gown in the most delicate shade of pale blue. It was Sally's favorite color. She hardly dared hope that the dress would fit, but it did perfectly. And the price was just a few dollars. When Sally and Davy arrived at the prom, the envious whispers grew louder and more persistent than ever. She looked truly beautiful in her pale blue evening gown. A lot of the other boys began to notice Sally for the first time. They all wanted to dance with her. But Davy chased them all away. He wanted every dance for himself. It was a magical evening. Sally danced and danced until she began to feel a little dizzy. She tried to shake off the feeling, for she didn't want anything to spoil her evening. But her dizziness grew worse, and she got a headache and a feeling of nausea too. "Sally, what's the matter?" "You look as if you feel sick," said Davy. "Yes, I do," she answered. "I think you had better take me home." On the drive home, Sally was feeling worse by the minute, and Davy was really getting concerned. But Sally's mother wasn't worried at all. "It's just the excitement," she said. She was looking forward to this evening so much, she became overexcited. That's how girls are. I remember I was the same way when I was her age. It's a shame to ruin such a lovely evening, but I'm sure there will be others. Davy agreed that there would be. Sally's mother took her upstairs, put her to bed, and told her she would feel much better after a good night's rest. But when her mother went to awaken her in the morning, she found that Sally didn't feel anything, because Sally was dead. At first, the doctors couldn't figure out what had killed her. Chemical tests showed that she had a high content of embalming fluid in her blood, and that's what did it. Heavy traces of the fluid were found on the pale blue satin dress she had worn. The doctors speculated that the fatal fluid had entered Sally's body when she perspired while dancing. The pawnbroker was questioned, and he finally admitted that he had received the dress from an undertaker's assistant. It turned out this assistant had been regularly stealing clothes from corpses before they were buried and pawning them at this particular shop. This was the first time any of the clothes had caused a problem.